Ms. Jessica Aiwuyor. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm sure you will correct me once you get on the platform, my dear. But she's joining us from the States, and is I love this, is a cultural storyteller and author, and has some words to share with us as we wait for her to get on the platform about African identity as a tool for education and liberation among youth, among Black American youth.
So in 1992, author activist Sister Soldier was featured on a panel by TV host Phil Donahue. And this panel was titled The Issue of Race. And during this discussion, Sister Soldier lamented about not only the failed educational state that is often ignored or not sufficiently addressed by the U.S. Department of Education and other educational programs in America, but she stated, in all of the programs that I attended, all of the education that I had, college, public, and otherwise, nobody ever told me that I was an African woman. Nobody ever told me what the history of African people was. At that time, Sister Soldier made the statement. I was only 7 years old. And of course, I didn't see the panel and probably wouldn't have understood it if I had. But I watched this panel much later in my mid-20s, and I related to so much of what she had to say. In all of my education, pre-K, elementary school, middle school, and high school, nobody ever told me that I was an African either. I learned that I was an African through context clues. For example, I heard about slavery and was told about sharecropping. And from the story of slavery, I asked, where did the people come from? And I can't to this day confidently say that anyone answered that very simple question for me. But thankfully, books did. I was lucky enough that my mother had some leftover Black history books from where she attended high school. And on quiet, lonely days, I would flip through the pages and learn about famous Black history moments and figures, as well as different parts of African American history. The only time that anyone ever referred to me as African in a school setting was during elementary school on the playground when children called each other names. It was during that time in the 90s, many dark-skinned African-American kids were called the derogatory term African booty scratcher. And to this day, I don't know where the term came from or what it even means, besides the fact that it was a derogatory term aimed at my Blackness and dark skin. So the one time anyone told me I was African in a school context, it was by other children, and it was negative. The other context clue I had was learning that I was a sickle cell carrier. And I learned this about 9 or 10 years old when the doctor explained to me that I would have to be careful about who I married when I grew up. And he explained to me that my bloodline came from West Africa. And I do remember smiling. Other than those two circumstances, nobody told me I was African, and nobody put it in a positive context. But once I learned for myself through various context clues, I wanted to learn more about what it means to be African. In high school, I read about Black history. And when I went to college, I majored in African World Studies, and grad school, I majored in Pan-African Studies. It was in college that I first read Kwame Nkrumah's famous refrain, "I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me." And this learning was more than about romanticizing. It was about the reclamation of identity and the continuation of Africanity, thoughts, cultures, beliefs, and more in the Black American identity. This reclamation is important because it serves as a foundation for Black self-determination in America. It was the reclamation of an African identity that moved our ancestors Richard Allen and Absalom Jones to found the longest standing Black institution in America, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they also founded the Free African Society, that provided food and money and shelter to newly freed Africans that had either escaped slavery or paid to get out of slavery. It was this reclamation of an African identity that the It was with this reclamation of the African identity that the Black Power movement drew self-determination and power from. And it was this reclamation of African identity that moved Black Americans to fight for South African people during the anti-apartheid movement, demanding that colleges and institutions divest from South Africa. Furthermore, it was the reclamation of an African identity that moved activists like Audley Queen Mother Moore to advocate for reparations for African descendants that were enslaved in the United States. I learned that African identity has proven time and time again to be a tool for education and liberation. And it was the embrace of African concepts like Sankofa, Mayat, Nomo, Ubuntu, and more that helped to reshape African American thinking from Eurocentric to African-centered. Even Pulitzer Prize writer Toni Morrison attributed the power behind her renowned ability to centralize Black Kennedy, stating in an interview, "I have spent my entire life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books. And the people who helped me most arrive at that kind of language were African writers, Chinua Achebe, Bessie Head, those writers who could assume the centrality of their race because they were Africans." During my time in college and grad school, I was able to travel to several different African countries. And almost every country I traveled to, people gave me a name. And I ultimately couldn't remember all of them, but it still signified that my distant relatives recognized me for who I was, an African returning from America. When I returned home from those trips, I brought with me clothing, jewelry, money, statues, paintings, everything that I could bring back. I gave them out to family members. I showed them to my mother and father. I shared pictures of different people and buildings, everything. So when I started working at after school programs and graduate school, I would make sure that after we completed the children's homework, we talked about Africa. And not surprisingly, just like me, most of my students that were predominantly Black American had also never been told that they were African. In undergrad, I had a group of 8 to 10 students in one class. And when I mentioned Africa, they said, "Africa," in disgust. "There's nothing there," they said. This type of thinking is due to what Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Black History Month, referred to as the miseducation of the Negro. In his book under the same title, Woodson laid out how the United States had miseducated generations of Black Americans, and this miseducation dismissed our cultural heritage as African descendants and focused on Black life as an existence to be despised. Thus, we had generations of Black Americans fooled into believing that Blackness was ugly and that Africa had contributed nothing to the world. This subsequently created self-hating Black people that viewed ourselves through racist European ideals, making us believe we deserved an inferior status in the world. However, having knowledge of our true history and our ancestors that arrived to America from the shores of West Africa gave us instilled pride, hope, and self-determination. So the next day, I brought with me to those students everything that I brought from Africa. I showcased the jewelry. I let them wear it. I showed them the money. I told them the stories. And this was the first time they ever saw Black faces on money. They were in awe and they said, "This came from Africa." And that was my entry point. Suddenly, all the negative things that they thought about the continent melted away because they realized that they knew nothing about Africa at all. And the little bit that I showed them made them want to learn more. And they were so excited that they were fighting over the jewelry. In another instance, I had children say the same thing at a different after-school program. And again, I brought the necklaces, I brought all the different cultural articles that I had. And they were, again, amazed at what Africa had produced, just with those few examples. Another time at an after-school program, my students were doing the same schoolyard bickering that I had endured. Instead of this time calling each other African booty scratcher, they were calling each other ugly African. I don't know where they heard this, but I'm sure it came from an ignorant, self-hating adult. And I was shocked that the teachers didn't stop them or correct them. So I loudly asked all of the children, do you know about slavery? They said, yes, Miss Jessica. I said, do you know where the ships came from? I said, do you know people came here on ships? They said, yes, Miss Jessica. I asked, do you know the people and where those ships came from? They were silent. I said, do you know those ships came from Africa? And they were silent. Then I explained, you are all Africans. Every single one of you is African. So now you have to decide either all of you are ugly or all of you are beautiful. A hush came over the children as they began to process something that no one had ever told them before. Today in 2020, the world seems on fire. Coronavirus is affecting African people globally, no matter what we call ourselves. And in the US, we're fighting the battle of police brutality and militarization against Black masses globally. And this moment is more than about protests. It's more than about an epidemic. It's a moment of African solidarity. And this is the time when Black youth and full-grown adults are learning for the first time that they are, in fact, Africans. The global solidarity shown through the work of Black activists combating these issues and uplifting Black life is the work of Pan-Africanism. We are African. We are learning this. For those of us who know we are African, and we know this is Pan-Africanism, for those of us that have a memory of the anti-apartheid movement and the Black Power movement in America, we know that we are strengthened by Pan-Africanism. And this is because activists and leaders had an understanding of themselves as Africans. Our African heritage grounds us. Our African heritage lays the groundwork for a self-centered worldview. It gives us the cultural roots for moving forward and creativity for reemerging out of the dust of oppression to a possibility of new glories. Those of us that learned we were African along our journey, we learned to continue to move forward through a cultural ancestral lens that pushes away from anti-Blackness and Afrophobia, and that we have a right to exist here on this earth, and we have a right to create a world that helps to sustain us on this earth. African identity is a tool for liberation. Kwame Nkrumah told us this. Queen Mother Moore told us this. Marcus Garvey told us this. Malcolm X told us this. Many of our ancestors told us this. And so it is pivotal for all educators, storytellers, and whatever you are in your community to make sure that Black youth know that African identity is more than a fashion statement. It is more than a word. It is a spirit, and it is a reminder of who we are in this world. It is a mandate for transformative change. So today, on African Youth Day, I hope my stories serve as a reminder that if you ever encounter a Black child, and if you ever want to lift up a Black child, mentor them, spend time with them, share books with them, teach them about their heritage, teach them about their culture, teach them about their ancestors, teach them about themselves, and tell them they're African.